welcome back to Catholic Reboot. This episode is titled 501c3 or Jesus. And the reason I'm naming it that is we are experiencing as Catholics this whole approach to attending Mass now. We pretty much in certain states have to either get online or call our church and say, I am going to be going to Mass, or I want to receive the sacraments. And then they'll look and they'll pretty much say, well, we have an opening, right? If we don't, the ability for us to just normally go to church when we normally go, to go to confession when we normally go, has somewhat ended. Now, for many, they'll say, oh, let it go. It's just as soon as this pandemic is over, you'll be able to resume your faith. Okay. Where does this come from? Well, this comes from when we start to look to our government and look away from the church. So what I've noticed is quite a lot of cardinals, bishops, parish priests, the rectors, all saying, we don't want to lose our 501c3 status. So we're going to comply with the government. Okay. Well, we've seen this before. You know, priests have been discouraged from voicing their opinion from the pulpit on certain matters of elections or politics because legally they could lose their 501c3 status. All right. Now, you may accuse me of being naive, but walk with me in my naivete for a minute. We are always told when we pay taxes, when the government has been unjust, that we should render unto Caesar what is Caesar. Now, I have to follow that up and say, do people really understand what Christ meant by that? And I'm going to get there, so we're not going to go there right away. Instead, what I want to approach is, how did we get here as American Catholics? Let's start there, okay? All right. For those that don't know their history, it's sad because they're just kind of like floating through the latest modern trend, being told what to understand, and they just have no rooting. There's no firm roots in anything. It's just there's no basis. History has a way of creating that basis of saying, well, the reason we're doing things now the way we're doing is something happened, right? It had to come from somewhere in our history. All right. I want to start there and say, as Americans, you know, and you'll see this with a lot of conservatives, you know, waving the American flag, patriotism, God bless America, that's all good. Matter of fact, Christ himself would promote nationalism because without a sense of nationalism, you don't have the roots in your own country. It's important. But if the nationalism has roots that go from our deposit of faith as Catholics, we got to say, whoa, wait a minute. Now, what am I leading to? If you get a chance, you need to go back and relearn history. Okay, first of all, there was a great book written. It's called Faiths of Our Founding Fathers, and I'll put that along the bottom. And it was written by David Holmes, okay? And his approach was to say, look, if we are following the foundation of our constitutional republic as the founding fathers laid out, who were they? Who were the founding fathers? And he did a great job of explaining the faiths of all the founding fathers, okay? Many think that, you know, most of the founding fathers were Protestant. Not true, okay? You can say that almost all the founding fathers may have believed in God or a deity, but not necessarily pure Christianity, and certainly not Catholicism. There's actually only one, John Carroll, who actually was a Catholic. And it's really interesting to show how the founding fathers' lives progressed after setting up the country and what ultimately happened to them, right? So if you get a chance, put this in your read list. Read the book. It's very good, okay? Now, the other thing I'm going to get into is most Catholics don't know about encyclicals, right? And I'll do a separate podcast or episode rather on encyclicals. But let me give you just a very 30,000 feet view of what an encyclical is. So when a pope is in office, okay, in the seat of Peter, they will write an encyclical, which is basically how to guide the faith in their understanding of something, right? So when a pope does that, they're pretty much stepping out of the protective box of just an opinion, and now they're actually making a statement that they're bound to, right? So when we've heard of things like papal infallibility, if a pope writes an encyclical and he puts his name to it, he is basically exposing the truths of the church, and if there's anything heretical in there, he can be held accountable for that. And that's why it's very important when the popes put their name to an encyclical, it means something. Well, Pope Leo, and I'll put the time period down there, had actually written an encyclical in the late I think it was 1890s. I'll get the exact date. But he wrote an encyclical on Americanism and those things that Catholics, especially American Catholics, have to be careful of. And what was he pointing to? He was pointing to, if you are going to live under a constitutional republic in a secular way, that should never affect your primary duty, which is to live your faith in a Catholic way. Those two cannot, the secular way cannot override the religious instructions of your faith. What has happened since the United States was founded is there's been a very heavy Protestantization of our understandings of life. And I actually went through this in a previous episode where I say, as Catholics, are we born to observe life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as our founding fathers dictated? Or are we supposed to live to know, to love, and to serve God? Now, many people say, oh my gosh, here you go with that overriding Catholicism. You can't live today if you follow the strict code of your Catholic faith. Well, I say quite the opposite. I say you can't be a Catholic if you override it with a secular ideology. Those two generally do not coexist. But we as Americans generally will try to dovetail those together and say, I think we can make it work. All right. So let's go back in time a little bit. Let's go back to the time of Jesus. And when Jesus tells the Pharisees, okay, now here's something else. I mean, we throw these terms around: Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians. So when Jesus tells the Pharisees, he's talking about the Jewish sect that is in charge of the strict observance of the traditional and written Hebrew law, right? They were like the sanctity superior, right? And we always learned that when Jesus approached the Pharisees, this was the religious law, right? So because this preceded Christ's passion and death, the Judaic law held precedent. So when Christ came before it, it would be like us coming before our Catholic faith and the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Has to be respect for the religious law. But he also came before not just the Pharisees, but what they're called the Herodians. Now, What's important to know about this is the Herodians were closely aligned with the Pharisees, but especially in opposition to Jesus. And they also were supporters of Herod and Herod's dynasty. Now, you'd say, well, does that matter? Yeah, because as you may remember, when Christ was being paraded through all these forced judgments with the Pharisees and with Pontius Pilate, and then finally with Herod, he responded to them. So when the Pharisees asked him questions, he responded. Now they would say blasphemy, but he at least responded, right? When Christ responded to Pontius Pilate asked him a question, Jesus responded. But Jesus never responded to Herod. Okay, that's very important, because had Jesus responded to Herod, he would have legitimized Herod's dynasty, and he could not, because it was not legitimate. Okay, so when we say the Pharisees and the Herodians, understand you got one group that is purely the strict observance of the law. The other one is doing that, but favoring, right, Herod's dynasty. Now you're going to say, what's this have to do with the subject matter? Well, we see the same thing today in our country, right? So there's our Catholic Church is coming out, and we attend Mass, and we'll see the priests giving us the deposits of the faith and giving us sermons to learn the faith, but to a certain degree they got a little bit of Herodins in them, right? They're pointing to our government as a legitimate source of authority. Now, you probably say, are you saying our government is not legitimate? I'm not there yet, so work with me here a little bit. Just understand the context. If we're going to go back in history, I want you to see what Christ was up against, and we can nicely dovetail that to what we're up against as Catholics. Because why? Because we're in Christ's church, right? So I like to say there's nothing new under the sun. Eventually things come back a little bit different, but in the spirit pretty much the same. All right. So what we hear from a lot of people, especially the church, is when they don't want to fight that just fight, they'll throw out Matthew's Gospel 22:21, to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. Okay? Well, that's exactly what Christ said. So rather than talk about our position today, let's talk about what Christ was dealing with and what he was saying. So he knew Caesar, being the civil authority, does have rights. And he knew that the people under the administration of Caesar owed Caesar the title of civil authority, okay? And that Caesar had to create that appropriate balance and obedience in whatever he was governing. Well, Pontius Pilate was a servant of Caesar, so be it. Pontius Pilate is the representative of Caesar. Okay. But what Christ was also saying during his ministry, that the obedience is limited to what belongs to God first and foremost. Caesar was not God. Only God can be God, right? So the state of being subordinate is always first and foremost to God, to us as humans, right? So why? Because we were all created by God. We were not created by Caesar, and if we want to make it relevant today, we were not created by the U.S. government or the President of the United States, right? So as Catholics, we need to figure out what these things that belong to Caesar really belong to Caesar, and what things belong to God, and we got to put them in the right order, right? Now, you would say, oh my gosh, our government is so corrupt, I don't know if there's anything we should render. Well, it's not true, because even in some of the craziness we're experiencing today, there is a civil authority. that needs to be corrected. Okay? All right. Now, let's go through, and this is a perfect time to go through this because we're getting very close to approaching the week of the Passion, right? So let's walk through John's verse 18:28. Jesus comes before Pilate. Okay, all right. So they brought Jesus to Caiaphas into the Praetorium. Now, many people don't understand what a Praetorium is. The Praetorium meant it was a governor. So Pilate was a governor, Roman governor, who was assigned the territory of Judea. And it's his official residence, right? So when Caiaphas, who we all know was ahead of the Pharisees, right, brought Jesus over to Pilate's Praetorium, many people may not know this, but Pilate and even the Sadducees could not enter into Pilate's Praetorium because it was considered a defiled place. And since Passover was coming in several days, they wouldn't be able to actually eat the Passover meal, right? So Pilate kind of humbled himself and came out. Most people don't know that. I'd like to say Pilate started conceding from the very beginning, right? So Pilate comes out and he said, "What accusations are you bringing against this man?" And then, of course, they answered him, not specifically, but they say, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." But Pilate was asking him, "But what is that?" And it was creative. It was very creative of the Pharisees to do that because they knew that Pilate could care less about the religious laws. In other words, you're handing him over to me as civil authority. Did he murder someone? Did he steal something? Was he involved in anything that would be of a civil matter that broke the law? And so they didn't answer that. They simply said, if this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Don't we see this going on in our government today? It's always the double talk. It's never the direct answer to the direct question, okay? So Pilate responds to him and says, "Take him yourself and judge him according to your law," right? Which was the appropriate response. Look, this isn't a civil matter. I'm not going to get involved. You know, it's almost like the case of a civil divorce and a sacramental divorce. You know, the church is not involved at all in the civil matter of a divorce. They don't even recognize it. But if someone goes then and remarries, they are now committing adultery. Then it becomes a break with the religious matter. So it's very important as we go through this, civil and religious, right? So when he said to them, take them and judge them according to their laws, they responded, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This is interesting. So once again, the Sanhedrin is punting. They're saying, we don't have the legal authority to kill him. Only you, the civil authority, can do that. Now, at that point, what is Pontius Pilate up against? He now realizes, and most people don't know this either, why was Pilate so apprehensive? Like, he was supposedly a pretty ruthless governor and general, right? Why would he even care? Because at that time, there was a lot of uprising going on, and Caesar was basically telling him, get your house in order down there, or you're out, right? And so, since this was Passover, that meant that Jews from all over came. So now Jerusalem was seeing this huge increase in population of people outside the territory. So Pilate had to be careful of what? An uprising against the Romans, right? So all Pilate is doing now is just trying to keep the peace, right? So Pilate then entered his Praetorium again. So he walked out, then he walks back in, and then he basically summons Christ in. And if you see the Passion of Christ, they do a great depiction of that. Pilate looks like this Italian guy saying, "Hey, get over here." You know what I mean? So, Jesus follows him in, and Pilate says, "You are the king of the Jews?" Right? Because he had heard this from his soldiers. They're attacking him because he's claiming to be king of the Jews. Well, what did Pilate know? He knew the perfect order between the civil and the religious authority. There is the Sanhedrin that's ahead of the dictates of the law, but there is actually a king who was Herod. So Pilate's saying, so they're saying that you're claiming to be the king of the Jews? Pilate is looking very civil-minded, not religious-minded. And Jesus answered him, "Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Now, most people misunderstand what Christ was saying here. They thought that what Christ was saying to Pilate was, "Did your soldiers tell you that? Did the people in the street tell you that? Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" What Christ was really referring to is two things. Many of you may know that Pilate's wife was secretly a follower of Christ. So when he would go and have his sermons, she was kind of had her robe over her head so she wasn't noticed, and she started to follow Christ and started to believe in Christ. And so she had a terrible dream about Christ and her husband being involved in his passion and death, and told him, you can't do this to him, right? That was number one. Number two, the Romans were pagans, but they worship a lot of different gods. In part of their own pagan faith, they were told that a man will come from God to change things. Okay? So Pilate was a little nervous here. First, he's got his wife in one ear, and then he's got his pagan faith in the other ear, saying, "Watch out, there's something very prophetic about this guy." And what I like about the Passion of the Christ is you see the pensive look in Pilate's face. He's not being this arrogant governor. He's kind of being compassionate, saying, "Dude, you got to talk to me. I mean, what's going on here? Is there something I should know?" Right? And then Pilate answered him when he said, "Did others tell you about me?" Pilate said, "Well, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Right? Again, this is Pilate's way of punting. He really doesn't know. I mean, in his world, when he goes out to take care of a matter in a civil case, he's got all the legal system behind him. He's got the Roman legions behind him. He basically has a civil system that feeds things up to him. This is way outside of his realm. Okay? So he's being concerned not to misstep. So when Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your nation and chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" He's being sincere. He's saying, "You got to help me understand what I'm dealing with here." Now, he's probably expecting Jesus to say, "They're just mean, and they're doing this unnecessary, and I didn't do any." And he didn't hear that out of Christ. Christ always speaks very succinctly. Sometimes it can be difficult to understand, but very succinctly in his responses, and sometimes asks a question when giving a response. So Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Okay, what an awesome statement, right? In other words, he would have had choirs and legions of angels coming in to decimate the whole area. But as we're taught, we're not of this world or in this world. Christ is the perfect example of that. He's saying, I have to endure this because of my partial human nature to suffer and die for man. Of course, Pilate had no idea what he was talking about, and Christ didn't really say it to benefit Pilate, but so that it would be written. And therefore, what? Then scriptures would be fulfilled, right? So Pilate, really confused now, said to him, so you're a king? You know, he's thinking, my pagan religion says that you could be the king coming, so are you a king? He didn't say, shame on you for considering yourself a king. I know Herod, he's the king. He didn't say that. He said, so you are the king? A question, right? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this purpose I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Now Pilate's going to get a little ticked off here. Who is this rabble-rouser who clearly has no royal line and could be nothing but a troublemaking talking about truth? So Pilate said to him, what is truth? Now, this line by Pilate has been misinterpreted many times. I've heard it said that what Pilate was saying is, we don't live in truth. We only live in the ability to make things seem truthful or not truthful. To a certain extent, Pilate, being the politician as a governor of Rome, would have said that in the sense of, we'll create any truth we need to justify this. But in reality, what Pilate was really saying is, the pagan gods that were supposed to deliver up someone that was going to bring a change was a change in what the truth is. Okay? So Pilate was using a quasi mode when he said, what is truth? Right? Now, after saying this, you know, by the way, Christ did not respond to that. You know, I always find it more important to what Christ didn't respond to than what he did sometimes. When Pilate said to him, what is the truth? He didn't go into a big dissertation. Scripture was being fulfilled. That was it. Christ was done. Zip it, right? Less is more. So after saying this, Pilate brings Christ out of the Praetorium again, satisfying the Jews, right? And said to them, I find no grounds at all for the charges in his case. But I do know you have a custom to release a prisoner during Passover. Do you wish me to release this so-called king of the Jews? And they shouted, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Okay, now I don't want to go into the whole passion. I just want to use this as a basis to say law, civil law has its limitations when it comes to Christ and Christ's church. When we start spouting these lines, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, we got to be careful, because what we have to remember is to a limit. Okay? Now, since this episode would go extremely long, and I want to keep them short, I'm going to have a second episode that ties well into this, and that's Americanism and Catholicism, okay? But the point I'm trying to make in this one is, when our church and our priests and our bishops and our cardinals start donning masks during the consecration of the Eucharist, start limiting the faithful from coming to their God, okay, and start saying, we will lose our 501c3 if we don't comply, you as Catholics have got to remind them, are you as a religious serving Christ? Because if you are, you're not even concerned with saving our lives, you're concerned with saving our souls. Now, more modern Catholics would say, oh, look at this nutcase. He's probably one of those anti-vaxxers. I'm not going into any of that. I'm saying, if we truly believe this is the Church of Christ, do we really not believe that he will take care of what needs to be taken care of? And as our religious in our churches need to lead us to Christ, they also have to remember, don't render unto Caesar what is not Caesar's. Okay? And I had a situation where I forgot to register on time for Mass and was turned away. Impossible. Impossible. The priest in charge of that parish turned away one of Christ's faithfuls due to what? Rendering under Caesar what was not Caesar's to render. Okay, thank you very much. Come back, because I do want to explain Americanism and Catholicism and tie in our founding fathers' understanding of the difference between civil authority and religious authority. And quite honestly, I think they watered us down for the worse. Okay, God bless you.